when I got into the field of energy, this really bugged me. I research energy full-time these days, but my actual background was in philosophy. And in philosophy, there's a really big emphasis on getting clear on what your terms are and on critical thinking. And whenever we hear someone say, this is really important, we need to embrace this, we need to do this, and yet it's not at all clear what that thing is, it's fishy. And so when I ran into this, it became really interesting to me, well, what exactly is green energy? And especially, what would it mean in practice? Because we're talking about changing the government's policy. What would it actually look like to practice green energy? Because if we don't know this, then we could either be adopting something really bad, if green energy is bad, or we could be depriving ourselves of something that's really good. And in terms of the rhetoric, green energy seems good. I mean, so who in here is opposed to cheaper, more abundant, cleaner energy? So we got no takers. No takers on that. And that's what green energy promises us. And yet, the more I explore this issue, the more I realize that this is not, in fact, what it's about at all. So tonight, what I really want to share with you are two observations that I've made over the years about green energy and the green energy movement that paint a very different picture of it than what one would think at the beginning. And I want to say from the outset, there is a very strong appeal to, say, the idea of getting all our energy from the wind and the sun. I mean, it is a fact that there is an enormous amount of energy that the sun emanates every second. I mean, if you take a minute's worth of the energy in total that comes from the sun, it could power the world for a year. There's an enormous amount of energy in wind as well. So there's a certain appeal of, well, why don't we just get it from there? Why are we spending all this time drilling and fracking and enriching uranium when we could just be harnessing it, from Mother Nature? And people are telling us, yeah, it would actually be way cheaper and way more environmentally friendly. So there's a definite appeal here. But again, the more I looked into this, the more I found something is really off. So let me tell you my first observation that I made. And that was that the green energy advocates are not trying to outcompete today's leading forms of energy. They're trying to either restrict them or ban them. So they're not trying to outcompete them, they're trying to restrict them or ban them. Now, if green energy is in fact a better product across the board, and we'll talk about it environmentally in a minute, but economically, if we hear, we need a green economy, that's going to be better, that's going to allow us to outcompete China, et cetera, that means it should perform well on the market. And I'll tell you a story about Al Gore. Al Gore in 2008 gave a really famous speech in which he claimed that he knew how to generate electricity using just the sun and the wind for the equivalent of $1 a gallon gasoline. Now, does anyone remember how high gasoline prices were in 2008? Yeah, I'm from California, so 5, where I'm from, Southern California. Yeah, so $4 or $5. Now imagine you've got this, a way to undercut big oil by a factor of 4 or 5. What is if one of you guys had that idea, what would you do with it? What? Implement it. Yeah, get rich. You'd start a business. Now you might say, well, I don't have any connections. It probably wouldn't be too hard to find some. But if Al Gore has anything, the man has connections. He's a top partner at Kleiner Perkins, which is the world's leading venture capital firm. I believe he's on the board of Apple as well. So you would expect Al Gore, if he had such a brilliant economic idea, he would be doing himself a favor and he'd be doing us a favor. He'd implement the idea, he'd produce all of this amazing new energy, and he'd get rich and we'd all benefit. But interestingly enough, in that speech, Al Gore didn't say one thing whatsoever about starting a business. He didn't propose a business, he didn't give his idea to anyone else. What he proposed was banning his competition. He said that we should stop using all fossil fuels for electricity generation by the year 2018, which is now 7 years away, incidentally. So he said, and that is, an enormous percent of our electricity generation. And on top of that, Gore wouldn't endorse hydropower and he wouldn't endorse nuclear power. The only things Gore said qualified as green energy were solar, wind, and geothermal, which combined produced 2% of American energy. Now Gore, again, he's claiming that he's got this brilliant thing, but he's offering absolutely no proof. Now, if you heard someone do that in any field, what would be your suspicion about their idea? If they said, well, I've got this brilliant idea, it could beat all the competition, but the policy should be to ban the competition. What would be your suspicion? Or would you have a suspicion? Would you think this is a great idea? Let's ban the competition and then live on solar and wind. You're shaking your head. Yeah, you wouldn't believe it. I mean, the way we test things anywhere is by putting them into practice. So Al Gore is saying, in effect, I've invented the iPhone of energy. I know the iPhone of energy. It's this way of using solar and wind. Well, when Apple brought out the iPhone, it didn't demand a banning of its competitors. It just said, look, we've got the greatest thing. Here are our reasons. You should take it. If you don't, that's fine. And they sold tens of millions of them. And yet the iPhone of energy refuses to compete on its own merits. So I think the conclusion to draw is it's not likely that this is actually economically competitive. And if we look at the people who've actually tried to put it into practice, what we see is really, really disastrous results. President Obama often likes to reference other countries that have invested more in green energy than we have, even though we've invested an enormous amount as well. And he says, think of what's happening in countries like Spain, where they're making real investments in renewable energy. Okay, so Spain spent a lot of money on green energy to try to get itself out of some economic doldrums, but didn't go quite as well as they wanted to. So residential electricity rates rose 20%. Industrial electricity rates, which are huge because that's your whole economy, they rose 100%. And the unemployment in Spain, whose green jobs cost an estimated $270,000 apiece, went over 20%. And that country is plunged into debt and a complete disaster. A place like Germany, now Germany has a more fundamentally healthy economy and hasn't spent as much on green relative to its economy. But in Germany, for solar power, if you produce solar power in that country, they guarantee you an eight times the normal rate on solar power. And what that means is that solar power is so much more expensive than the other kinds of power, they need to guarantee 8 times the price for it. Now imagine if that was spread across the whole economy. They can only get away with it because it's on a small scale. So what we see in practice is when these green energy policies are implemented on a very small level, they're extremely expensive. But that's nothing compared to what they would be if they were implemented on a large scale. Because, especially if the leading forms of energy, which are fossil fuels, hydroelectric, and nuclear, if those were banned, then we would be forced to use these things that can be many, many more times expensive. So all the actual evidence is that this stuff is economically disastrous. And that's what you would expect from a movement that's trying to ban its competitors. And this is really scary when you talk about energy, because energy is the lifeblood of an economy. I mean, energy is directly correlated to standard of living, because energy is our ability to do physical work. It's the ability of our machines to move things around. The only way that we have such a wealthy country with a life expectancy of 80 instead of 30 is we have lots and lots of machines using lots and lots of energy. One scholar named Matt Ridley calculated that we have the equivalent of 600 servants apiece in terms of the amount of energy that our machines are using. So if that energy collapses, our standard of living collapses. Not to say anything of the standard of living in the poorer parts of the world, where in China and India in the last 25 years you've had a dramatic increase of standard of living, mostly due to fossil fuels. And in the poorest parts of the world, you've had 1.6 billion people gain access to clean water in the last 20 years, due in large part to increases of energy. All of this stuff can collapse if we don't have the right energy policy. Now, just quickly, I want to go back to the issue I raised at the beginning of the promise. It seems so promising that, well, why can't we get all of our energy from the sun and the wind? Well, the big thing, and Al Gore loves this statistic about how much energy there is in the sun. The problem with that is there's never been an issue of how much energy exists in nature. Since the beginning of time, the whole world is just a ball of matter and energy. I mean, there's energy in this room. If we could harness the forces that hold together the atoms in this room, we could do whatever we wanted. The challenge in energy, and which was really only solved, a little over 200 years ago at all, is what's called conversion. So taking the unlimited potential supply of energy in nature and turning it into actual usable energy. And so far, there have only been 3 practical ways of doing this. One is burning fossil fuels, which are concentrations of old plant and animal matter. Another is nuclear, which is using the power of the split atom. And another is hydro, which is using the power of natural concentrations of running water. That's it. The reason that solar and wind have been so impractical, and I would never say, oh, it can never work. I'm just saying there's no evidence that it will anytime soon, is because it faces 2 basic physical problems, at least. And one is called the diluteness problem, which is that as much energy as there is in total from the sun, any given patch of land is only going to have a relatively small amount. So that means to gather a lot of sun or a lot of wind, you need to use huge amounts of resources, which means huge amounts of concrete, huge amounts of steel, huge amounts of land, huge amounts of labor, huge amounts of what are called rare earth elements, which can be very expensive, can also be very toxic. So it's enormously resource intensive. And then the second problem is called the intermittency problem. And this relates to the idea that to have effective energy, it needs to be cheap, it needs to be abundant or plentiful, and it needs to be reliable. And so to be reliable,